I'm ELD. Welcome to You Can Play Legacy, a series about legacy decks on a modern budget. In this case, way cheaper than your typical modern deck. This Manaless Dredge. Here is a printed deck list and a visual spoiler. Feel free to rewind and pause on those if you want to take a good long look, but we're going to break down each card choice here, starting with biggest enabler in the deck, Phantasmagorian. This guy lets you discard 3 cards from your hand if he's in your graveyard, which brings us to our first point. This deck is very unusual in that you actually go to your end step and discard every single game. That is just what this deck does. It keeps on 7, and it just discards the best card that it can and goes from there. So you're always choosing to be on the draw. There are very few exceptions to this. You'd be totally fine just always keeping that rule, and this will allow you to have an explosive start that's also really difficult to interact with because you're just using the game mechanics. You're just discarding the cards, and it's really hard to interact with, particularly game 1. This deck can really grind people out, but it can also kill people as soon as turn 2. We will get to that towards the end of the breakdown. But first, let's talk about the core engine. Once upon a time, a recent printing, still feels pretty new to me, which is crazy because it's like 3 years old now. But this card allows you to dig for whatever you need. It's going to be the first spell you cast because this deck really doesn't play very many spells at all, and it ups your green count for the sideboard. What are we trying to get in the graveyard? Dredgers. That's the whole point. We're trying to get Golgari Grave-Troll, who's the best of them, into the graveyard, and then replace our draws with dredging. So for those unfamiliar, dredge 6 means you mill 6 and then put the card back into your hand from your graveyard. And that's not something people can respond to. That's just a replacement effect. So if somebody has a surgical, they do need to time it correctly. Once you are resolving a draw, we're past that point, and you can go ahead and mill. Stinkweed Imp, slightly worse. Dredges 5, still impressive. It is a black creature, so it'll help out with some other synergies. And then the worst of the bunch, Golgari Thug. Just a necessary evil for this deck. What can you do? You can't play 12 Golgari Grave-Trolls, so we do need to make some concessions. But we are jamming a ton of dredge cards in hopes that every single draw is going to be replaced with a dredge. Speaking of draws, this is a way of drawing extra cards. With Street Wraith, you can pay 2 life, discard it to draw a card. This is a tremendous accelerant. This deck kind of went away a little bit after it lost Gataxian Probe. In between 4 copies of Probe and Street Wraith, you actually did have a lot of turn 2 wins with this deck. Now you only have the 4 Street Wraiths, but honestly, the rest of the format kind of slowed down too with Probe going, so it's probably just a net neutral move. I mean, it's not like you were the best deck. You do have to pass the turn, so like you're opening yourself up to decks that can just kill you on the very first turn, whereas here this is a tremendous accelerant for the deck. Now, as we're milling through the library, one of the best things we can hit is Narcomoeba. This is a free 1/1 body, which will have a ton of utility, which we will see. Of course, we're going to need to get some creatures actually on board. Getting stuff into the graveyard is not enough, so Narcomoeba, the best one. Ichorid, you have to wait a turn. But at the beginning of your upkeep, you can return this. This is a way of grinding your opponent out, just continually coming back from the graveyard and smacking them in the teeth. And we also have Nether Shadow with us since the beginning of the game, that iconic Christopher Rush art, one of the few cards that cares about graveyard order. And that's a reason, probably the primary reason why you can't just shuffle your library in Legacy, because there are cards like Nether Shadow that care, this, I believe, being the most notable of them. Of course, all of those creatures are looking to pair with Bridge from Below. This enchantment, when it's in your graveyard, has a pair of triggered abilities. The one we care the most about is whenever one of our non-token creatures dies, we get a 2/2 zombie, and that counts for each copy of Bridge from Below. So that means that we could potentially have an Ichorid enter the battlefield, die at end of turn, and spawn 4 2/2 zombies. All of this for no mana is just an incredible value and allows you to really grind out your opponent. Bridge from Below is an absolutely essential card in the deck, and it's a frequent target for surgical extraction, as that card, I mean, if this is left unchecked, you're just going to wreak absolute havoc over your opponent. Cabal Therapy, excellent card in this deck, allowing you to disrupt from the graveyard, stripping your opponent's hand, sometimes of multiple cards, either through having multiple copies of Cabal Therapy or just naming a card that they have multiples of. And that's also, of course, going to play very well with Bridge from Below, allowing you to sacrifice your creatures and generate extra bodies. Hogaak, is another printing, which is tremendously strong in this shell. It's black and green, so tons of utility. And this guy can really let you go wide and just go over the top. So as an 8/8 trampler, he's absolutely massive, but you can also generate a ton of bodies using Hogaak along with another creature to convoke and bring out another Hogaak from your graveyard. When you do, tapped one can die to state-based effects, spawning a bunch of zombies from Bridge from Belows, and you can just repeat that as much as you can delve, going super wide and way over the top, and really defeat most decks in a combat situation. I mean, this can get completely out of control thanks to this legendary creature, which is extremely difficult to stop. I mean, if you counterspell it, he just goes back to the graveyard and you can just cast him again. We have Vine Dryad to help out. I thought this was a nice spicy addition to this list, giving you that extra body for those early Hogaaks where you can convoke him out a bit faster than your opponent might be expecting, while also upping your green count. Of course, put it off as long as we can here. The grand finale of this deck, what it's really looking to do, is Dread Return. Now, we've already seen some potential Dread Return targets, but this is really what it's about. Sacrificing 3 creatures to bring back Balustrade Spy. So we're not playing any lands in this deck, so when we hit Balustrade Spy, we put our entire library into the graveyard, getting all of the triggers, all the Narcomoebas, all of our Cabal Therapies are online, all of our bridges are in there, 4 copies of Dread Return. I think this might only run 3. The point is, you are just dumping absolutely everything in there and winning on the spot by then Dread Returning Flayer of the Hatebound after you've shredded your opponent's hand. This enters the battlefield, it's going to dome your opponent, and then you can use 1 more copy to bring back a Golgari Grave-Troll, which is going to be absolutely massive because you have a ton of creatures in your graveyard, and when that Grave-Troll enters the battlefield, that'll trigger Flayer again, and like 40 damage to your opponent's face, winning in spectacular fashion, sometimes as early as turn 2. There's also a copy of Ashen Rider in there in case you run into any problems, though I'm not totally in love with this card. It does give you some answers. Sometimes you just can't beat everything. Sometimes it's okay to just like lose to certain things, but this pilot in particular really wanted to have answers to everything. And Ashen Rider is also a pretty filthy card versus show and tell decks as well. So that is the main deck. We're going to quickly go over the sideboard. Faerie Macabre is the graveyard disruption of choice. You can find this with Once Upon a Time. It's a black creature, so you can use it with Ichorid. It's just overall very strong and will allow faster decks like Reanimator will allow you to interact with them. Leyline of Sanctity versus Storm decks and Burn and the such that are going to be targeting you. This is very strong and slowing things down. Force of Vigor. I don't actually love that because you have to play it from your hand and kind of delay the inevitable discard, but it is what it is. Force of Vigor, this card I love in the sideboard. This is amazing. It's probably the strongest thing I see about this list is the abundance of green cards, so you can actually make these Force of Vigors happen. Your opponent might have a Leyline and a Grafdigger's Cage, and you can just get both of those out of there for no mana, just 2 cards, and be on your way. It's also got some removal in Sickening Shoal, and Vengeful Pharaoh, which is a pretty spicy card. I don't know if it's any good, but it's pretty interesting. And when it's in your graveyard, it's going to be pretty difficult to repeatedly attack you, especially with smaller creatures. So that's really interesting. I don't know if that card's any good. I haven't played it, but it is certainly spicy. A couple of other notes. If you are playing against a ton of show and tell, you can sideboard a card like Blightsteel Colossus or Progenitus to allow you to shuffle your creature back in. So if someone plays a show and tell, you can actually put in a Balustrade Spy and you'll actually just mill your entire library and then kill them on your next turn. It's spicy tech, also something to consider versus Reanimator. There's all sorts of other options for this deck as well. If it's something you're interested in, cards like Grief could also be very interesting, as you'll get the synergy with Bridge from Below and be able to go after your opponent's hand, making your Cabal Therapies even better. Well, that is it for Manaless Dredge. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again on the next installment of You Can Play Legacy.